In the summer of 1861, merchant Wilmer McLean was living in Manassas, Virginia, when a heavy artillery cannonball ripped straight through his kitchen wall. It was the first major engagement of the American Civil War. Terrified for his family's safety, McLean packed up his belongings to put as much distance between himself and the fighting as possible. He moved 120 miles south to a sleepy, quiet village called Appomattox Courthouse, certain the violence would never reach him there. 4 years later, after hundreds of thousands of casualties and entire cities reduced to ash, the commanders of both armies finally sat down to sign the ultimate surrender papers, and they did it inside the drawing room of this exact house, Wilmer McLean's new home. McLean spent the rest of his life remarking that the war began in his kitchen and ended in his parlor. His absolute inability to outrun the conflict mirrors the broader American reality of the 1860s. The country had spent decades trying to sidestep its own deep contradictions about human freedom. Eventually, the bill came due, and there was nowhere left to hide. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was effectively two separate nations. The North held over a third of the country's factories and a rapidly expanding railway network built by wage laborers. The South, meanwhile, had very few large cities, relying almost entirely on sprawling agricultural plantations to generate its wealth. That immense Southern wealth came from a monopoly on the global cotton trade, and that monopoly ran on the forced labor of nearly 4 million African people. By 1860, the financial value of enslaved human beings in America exceeded the value of all the nation's banks, factories, and railroads combined. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 on a platform explicitly opposing the expansion of slavery, Southern plantation owners saw an imminent threat to their entire economic structure. Before Lincoln even took the oath of office, 7 states broke away to form the Confederacy. Weeks later, their military forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Southern elite calculated that a life without free labor would mean total financial ruin. To protect that system, they chose armed rebellion, pulling the trigger on a conflict that would tear the nation in two. For the young men holding the rifles, grand political debates faded into the mud. These were mostly farm boys living in squalor. Doctors at the time had no knowledge of bacteria or germ theory. Camp latrines were dug right next to the rivers where soldiers drew drinking water. Because of this, 2/3 of the roughly 750,000 men who died in this conflict were not killed by enemy fire. They were killed by rampant infections, typhoid, and horrific outbreaks of dysentery. Surviving the camp was a daily struggle. Soldiers wrote in their diaries of going a week without bread or meat, forced to forage for raw corn. Many marched barefoot through the winter, their feet leaving blood on the dirt roads. And if a soldier was wounded in battle, they faced primitive medical tents where surgeons amputated shattered limbs with unsterilized bone saws, entirely without anesthesia. As the body count climbed, Lincoln realized the sheer scale of the sacrifice required a higher purpose. In 1863, he issued this document. The Emancipation Proclamation legally declared that all slaves in rebellious states were to be freed. Lincoln redirected the entire purpose of the war. By committing the government to destroying human bondage, he gave the grueling deaths in the mud and the hospitals a clear moral weight. The country was paying in blood to correct its original sin. Guiding this carnage were 2 very different commanders. The South leaned on Robert E. Lee, an aristocrat who gave his officers wide freedom. The North eventually found its champion in Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant possessed a cold, mathematical approach to warfare. Grant understood that simply capturing real estate wouldn't end the rebellion. He had to destroy Lee's army entirely. Utilizing the North's massive advantages in population and industrial output, Grant pushed forward relentlessly. He absorbed heavy casualties, refusing to retreat, until he completely exhausted the Confederacy's men and supplies. By April 9, 1865, Lee was cornered, and his men were starving. He agreed to meet Grant in Wilmer McLean's parlor. Lee arrived looking majestic in a pristine, brand-new dress uniform, carrying a ceremonial sword. Grant arrived straight from the field, wearing a mud-splattered private's coat, with no sword at all. Grant had the authority to try every Confederate soldier for treason. Instead, following Lincoln's strict guidance, he required only that the defeated men lay down their weapons and swear their loyalty to the United States. He even allowed the defeated rebels to keep their personal horses, noting they would need the animals to plow their fields for the spring harvest. Letting men walk away with their animals rather than placing them in chains was a calculated political decision. It was an immediate attempt to de-escalate the hatred, inviting former enemies to return home and begin repairing a shattered society. The nation's relief barely lasted a week. 5 days after the surrender, President Lincoln attended a comedy play in Washington, D.C. A Confederate sympathizer sneaked into the presidential box at Ford's Theater and shot Lincoln from behind. The architect of the Union victory was dead. But the country Lincoln left behind was permanently consolidated. Before 1861, states viewed themselves as highly independent entities. The immense mobilization required to fight the war established a supreme federal government with a massive military, national taxes, and tight control over the economy. This chart shows how the wartime demand for weapons and logistics triggered massive industrial expansion. Between 1865 and 1898, American coal production surged 800%, and the railway network expanded by over 500%. By the 1880s, the United States had surpassed Great Britain in manufacturing. The destruction of the Southern agrarian model shifted the country's entire economic weight to the North's factories. By 1890, this industrial consolidation allowed the U.S. to surpass the United Kingdom as the world's leading manufacturer, creating the logistical foundation for the global influence that followed. Despite the economic boom, the social reality remained deeply grim. During the Reconstruction era, millions of newly freed slaves were legally recognized as citizens, but they were turned out into society with no land, no money, and virtually no protection. When federal troops eventually withdrew from the South, local white authorities quickly established systemic barriers. They enforced strict segregation and instituted complex voting restrictions. Signs like this colored-only waiting room mandate became the blueprint of the Jim Crow era, effectively replacing physical chains with legal ones to maintain a strict racial hierarchy. Simultaneously, a powerful revisionist movement took hold. Southern writers and politicians aggressively promoted the lost cause myth. They rewrote textbooks and erected towering statues of Confederate generals, falsely claiming the war was a noble defense of state sovereignty, rather than a fight to preserve human slavery. The ink drying in Wilmer McLean's parlor officially silenced the cannons. The Union was preserved, and the institution of slavery was broken. But the decades of segregation and violence that followed prove that military force can only dictate who holds power. Building a truly equal society out of a fractured one requires generations of active, grueling work.